Myst, Might, Mayhem. By Han Jung-Wioya. Chapter 363. Sword. Part 4. Drip. The face of Okianmu, master of the spiritual sword sanctuary, was instantly covered in cold sweat. His eyes wouldn't leave the single character for sword that Mok Jiangun had engraved. Though it appeared he was just staring on the surface, slash. Clang clang clang. He had already fallen into a mental state where he was competing against the sword intent contained in the sword character. No, the expression competing wasn't accurate. Overwhelmed by the sword intent, despite having achieved the way of the sword, extreme of the sword, he was struggling just to defend against it. How could this be? Though it was just a single character, this sword intent contained immeasurable power. To handle that power, he tried to unleash all the sword techniques containing his enlightenment, but he couldn't approach it in any way. There are no openings. He employed all the sword techniques he knew to find a weakness, but he couldn't compare to this sword. This was truly the sword close to the extreme that he had been longing for. How could such a thing happen? It made his generations of crafting and training with swords seem futile. He wasn't the only one who had fallen into shock. More than half of those present had fallen into a mental state upon seeing the sword Mok Jiangun had engraved, and they couldn't come to their senses, gripped by trembling. This was especially true for those who had dedicated everything to the sword. The same was true for Zhang Myong Sate of the Hangshan sect. How could this be? She was quite intelligent, enough to gain enlightenment just from seeing the way of the sword, extreme of the sword. But this was on a completely different level. If Master O's way of the sword, extreme of the sword was like seeing the soliloquy of a lofty blade user who had climbed to the peak of a mountain, this sword was on an entirely different track. Rather, it showed the ultimate through the sharpness of the sword itself. It was truly arrogant, no, boundlessly presumptuous. It was as if it was saying that under heaven, only this was a sword. It's a sword that subjugates everything. This was the honest feeling she had. Any sword disciple would inevitably fall into shock, trembling, and a sense of defeat. Clang. Eventually, even the sword she was holding fell. The sword valley was died in silence as if everything had stopped. The only sounds that could be heard were the helpless dropping of swords here and there. Clang. Clang. Watching this, O Yianwu, who was prostrated, couldn't hide his inner excitement. Is this the one the order has been waiting for? Although he had directly seen Mok Jiangun's strength, he had inwardly expected that he wouldn't match his father, who could be called the pinnacle of the current martial world, one of the six heavens. Yet here were his father, Master Okianmu, and these many sword disciples, unable to hide their shock at the sword character engraved on the cliff. The reactions around were the same. Just looking at this, the winner of this sword discussion had been decided. O Yianwu's eyes reddened. He had been afraid of losing his love, Yi Sang-a. But with this, neither his father Okianmu nor anyone else here would hold her responsible, so it seemed he could rest easy. Thud. Feeling so grateful, O Yianwu bowed deeply to Mok Jiangun, hitting his forehead hard on the ground. He was truly a savior. But then... Hook! At that moment, someone's shout was heard from somewhere. Looking in that direction, they saw O Wungsong, the second son of Master O, holding onto the ground with one hand near the cave leading out of the sword valley. When had he gone there, when he had been nearby until just now? As they were wondering, where are you going? Why you? Come here. Grab. Mok Jiangun, who was walking on air down towards the cliff, made a gesture of pulling him with his hand. Then O Wungsong, who had been holding on to the ground with his left hand, was forcibly pulled. Aya! Scrape 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 scrape. He struggled so hard that his fingernail marks were left on the ground. Eventually, even his fingernails were torn off, leaving blood marks. Young Master O! Catch the young master! Hearing his screams, some of the spiritual sword sanctuary sword disciples who had shallow mental states due to lack of enlightenment were startled and tried to stop this. However, thud. as Mok Jianan lightly raised his hand upward. Thwack! The body of the second son O Wung Song, which had been dragged along the ground, floated up, flew past them to near Mok Jianan, and was thrown down onto the ground. Damn it! O Wung Song, sprawled on the ground, didn't know what to do. Seeing his father, Master O Qianmu, and most of the sword disciples unable to hide their amazement and shock, he thought everything had gone wrong and believed he needed to escape this place somehow. But to be caught like this before he could even run away. Feeling dismayed, O Wung Song seemed to think better of it and shouted, what are you doing? The master took a step back and agreed to end this by discussing swords. So why are you committing such violence? Violence? What an interesting thing to say. At that moment, the sword disciples of the spiritual sword sanctuary hurriedly ran over to try to protect O Wung Song. Don't touch young Master O. Protect young Master O. Just as they were about to get close to the second son O Wung Song, Mok Jianan drew a line of sword intent in front of them. A line made of sword energy was created on the ground, and they had no choice but to stop momentarily. Mok Jianan warned them in a dry voice, I advise you not to cross that line. Though there wasn't particularly any killing intent in it, the pressure made the sword disciples unable to easily cross the line with stiffened faces. However, just because they couldn't cross the line didn't mean their mouths were frozen too. Is this how you repay the kindness shown by the master? Do you really want to go against our sect? Mok Jianan ignored their protests. Instead, he approached the second son O Wung Song and said, not content with coveting something that wasn't yours, you've been quite troublesome. What are you talking about? I didn't covet anything, I was just trying to protect against the dangerous fire faith order. Before he could finish speaking. Thud. Something fell to the ground, flapping. At that moment, a scream of pain burst from O Wung Song's mouth. Arg. This was because his one remaining left arm had been cut off. He had just stopped the bleeding on his right arm, but now with his left arm cut off too, his face instantly turned pale due to the blood gushing out like a fountain. Why you madman? Young Master. Seeing the second son O Wung Song rolling on the ground, staining it with blood, the sword disciples shouted and tried to cross the line. Right at that moment. Rumble rumble. Whoosh! On the cliff ground lay the swords of the sword disciples who had died because of the blade user. Suddenly, these masterless swords all rose up at once and flew like living things to block the path of the sword disciples. Their expressions hardened at the 8 or so swords blocking their way. This? Sword control with energy? It was the marvel of sword control with energy. With not just 1, but 8 swords blocking their way, they were momentarily at a loss, caught off guard by the pressure of this amazing sight. They had occasionally seen Master O Qianmu, one of the 6 heavens, demonstrate sword control with energy. But even then, it was just 1 sword, or at most 2 or 3. Yet seeing 8 swords being controlled simultaneously before their eyes, they even began to doubt. This can't be. No matter what, he can't be stronger than the master, right? Is it just a bluff? No, for a bluff, this is. The movement of the swords was not ordinary. Each sword felt as if it were truly alive. If he could really control this many swords not just with simple air grasping but with the marvel of sword control with energy, he would be nothing short of a monster beyond imagination. As they were suppressed by these controlled swords, unable to move, Mok Jianan approached the second son O Wung Song rolling on the ground and continued speaking. It's not over yet. Ugh. What are you going to do to me? That tongue. Swish. Mok Jianan reached out his hand. Then. Yuerg. Hack. The second son O Wung Song's mouth was forcibly opened, and his tongue stuck out. The eyes of O Wung Song, who was even shedding tears from the pain of his severed arms, shook wildly. No matter how you looked at it, this monster-like guy's goal was clear. It was his tongue. Pleha. Unable to pronounce properly because his tongue was caught, he made unintelligible sounds. It looked like he was pleading to anyone who saw. At that moment, someone hurriedly ran over and knelt on the ground. They were none other than O Yianhua and Junior Master O Wung Huang. Master of the Holy Fire, please stop. Sir. I will apologize, so please show mercy to my brother. As if they had coordinated beforehand, they tried to protect the second son O Wung Song. Seeing this, Mok Jiangnan smiled slightly and said, "What close brothers you are. But that's that, and consequences are consequences." Swish. Ak. As Mok Jiangnan moved his hand slightly, the second son O Wung Song's tongue began to twist and turn. It seemed he wasn't going to cut it off, but twist and tear it out. At this, O Yianhua desperately shouted, hitting his head on the ground, "Please. Please. Save my brother. Who said anything about killing him? I'm just extracting the price for carelessly wagging that 3-inch tongue." Mok Jiangnan's attitude was utterly firm. But then, someone's voice was heard. "You shall stop." At that moment, the surroundings stirred. The owner of the voice was none other than Master O Qianmu. He had somehow regained his senses after being immersed in a mental state, unable to take his eyes off the sword engraved on the wall. As Master O, one of the 6 heavens, was the only one in this place who could stop that monster-like person, everyone's eyes showed relief. As if responding to these expectations, O Qianmu approached where Mok Jiangnan was and said, "Are you trying to pull out that child's tongue?" Rather than pulling out, tearing off would be a more fitting expression. Roar. No sooner had he finished speaking than Master O Qianmu's true energy burst out in all directions. Anyone could see he was enraged. Seeing him like this, all those around first felt relief, but then couldn't help feeling anxious inside. They had thought that with the master taking a step back, a fight wouldn't break out. But because of that person's actions, the atmosphere had changed. No matter how good-natured Master O was, from the standpoint of a parent with children, this wasn't a situation that could be tolerated. So it's come to this after all. The aftermath might be huge. Everyone watched tensely. But right at that moment. Swish. Master O Qianmu's body trembled slightly, and then, suppressing his anger, he clasped his hands together and showed respect to Mok Jiangnan. Everyone couldn't hide their bewilderment at this sight. Why on earth was he doing this? Then Master O spoke. "The child has already paid enough of a price with both arms cut off. If you take his tongue as well, his situation would be no different from death. Please, in your generosity, show mercy." Everyone was shocked. They had thought he would surely be unable to contain his anger and fight, but Master O suppressed this and stepped back once again. Was it parental love? Or patience to prevent greater sacrifices? Despite this, Mok Jiangnan seemed not to care at all, smiling slightly and saying, "I apologize. It seems I've shown enough mercy by not killing him. And decisively, I don't possess a generous heart." Swish. With those words, Mok Jiangnan slightly moved his finger. Then the second son O Wung Song's tongue, which was already half twisted, turned even more. Crunch. Aarg. O Wung Song screamed and rolled on the ground in such pain. He was already deathly pale from excessive blood loss, and if the bleeding wasn't stopped quickly, he might lose his life. Then. Shing. Master O Qianmu drew his sword from its scabbard. Would this finally lead to a fight? At that moment. Slash. Something no one expected happened. Master O Qianmu grabbed his sword with the opposite hand and cut off his own right arm. Thud. His right arm fell helplessly to the ground. Everyone was too shocked to speak as they stared at it. For him, a craftsman and sword disciple, his right arm was as precious as a 1,000-year treasure. Yet he cut it off without a moment's hesitation. As everyone stood there with their mouths open, Master O Qianmu, gripping his bleeding wrist and enduring the pain, spoke. "Ha, ha. A child's wrongdoing originates from the parents who taught them. Let this serve as the price instead." Chapter 364. Sword. Part 5. Master O Qianmu's right arm, still twitching as if sensation remained, spurting blood. Crack, crack, crack. The ground where the right arm had fallen was split in several directions as if struck by a sharp sword. His right arm, which had reached the realm of oneness with the sword and the way of the sword, extreme of the sword through long years of training, was like a sword itself. This alone showed how high a realm he had reached in swordsmanship, but even more shocking was, and master? Why did he do it himself? He had cut off his own right arm, which could be called the treasure of a craftsman and sword disciple. At this sight, everyone was momentarily speechless. Why on earth did he make such a choice? He was the master of this sword valley, called the sacred place of swordsmanship, and the spiritual sword sanctuary, as well as one of the 6 heavens, the pinnacle of the current martial world. No matter how one thought about it, there was no reason for him to go this far. Even if that monster-like person's swordsmanship was beyond imagination, no one here thought Master Okianmu would be inferior to him. Ugh. The eyes of the second son O Wungsong, whose tongue was caught by Mok Jiangun's true energy, shook wildly. He too was greatly shocked. He had thought his father would surely fight for honor and pride. Although he was a son, he wasn't particularly favored compared to his older brother, the junior master, in martial arts, or his younger brother Yanwu in craftsmanship skills. Therefore, he didn't have high expectations of his father. He thought it would be fortunate enough if he just wasn't left to die. But why? Why did he cut off his arm that he cherished so much? Is a painful finger still a finger? Enough to throw away his pride as a martial artist and his life as a craftsman? Although he was narrow-minded and wayward compared to his brothers, at this moment, he couldn't help but feel complicated emotions welling up inside. Ugh. Seeing O Wungsong shedding tears, people thought that Master Okianmu was indeed a father. A father who could sacrifice anything for his son. However, they're mistaken. Goe, who was watching this scene from afar, snorted. Right now, they thought Master Okianmu had unhesitatingly sacrificed his precious arm to save his son. But from his perspective, it wasn't like that at all. Humans tend to see only as much as they know. In this place, excluding Master Okianmu, the only one who had reached the highest realm in both swordsmanship and martial arts, surpassing the wall, was himself. At most, Zhang Myong Sate of the Hangshan sect might vaguely guess as she was approaching the wall, but that sword engraved on the wall was truly in a league of its own. He too had been momentarily gripped by a sense of defeat upon seeing the trace engraved on that cliff. This was incomparable to the shock of seeing the way of the sword, extreme of the sword. An unattainable, distant height. That's a real monster. A monster who had reached a realm that even Master Okianmu couldn't attain. To be honest, if Okianmu and that person were to fight, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say the outcome was somewhat predetermined. Unless some special variable occurred, Master Okianmu's victory would be difficult. He knew this himself, which is why he cut off his own arm. Cunning old man. Goe had been here for a long time, so he knew well how cunning Okianmu, a figure respected by the world, was. He was a man who, under the pretext of guiding later generations with his way of the sword, extreme of the sword, kept numerous swordsmen here and shared their insights to further develop himself. He never takes actions that result in a loss for himself. That's why even when crafting swords, he received the recipient's unique sword techniques in return. Who else could make such a bold request? If we clash, he loses everything. That's why Okianmu made the extreme choice of cutting off his own arm. In fact, those present still believed in Okianmu, so they didn't realize, but he could see it. If he didn't show at least this much sincerity, who knows how the opponent might react? He secured his justification. Given this, even that monster-like person would find it difficult to persist further. He had even cut off his right arm for his son, so going beyond this would be crossing the line. If there's a minimum level of propriety, he should stop here. Although Okianmu had lost an arm, thanks to the public perception that he sacrificed for his son, he wouldn't lose his pride as a martial artist. But right at that moment, you've done something unnecessary. One's own mistake is simply one's own mistake. What are you? I clearly said it. You've done something unnecessary. Swish. Mok Jiangun moved his hand. Then the second son O Wongsung's tongue twisted and finally tore partially, causing blood to burst out. Splurt. Aya. It was on the verge of being completely torn off. At this sight, O Qianma finally couldn't contain his anger and shouted, "How dare you? It's not how dare you. I never told the master to take responsibility as a parent. And one's own mistake should rightfully be one's own responsibility." What? At Mok Jiangun's firm words, Master O Qianmu became not just angry, but dumbfounded. As Jioi had predicted, he had realized through the trace on the cliff that even if he competed with Mok Jiangun, his chances of winning were low. Therefore, he cut off his right arm, swallowing tears of blood, to gain the justification of sacrificing for his son. This is a fight that must be avoided. There was too much to lose, so he had to avoid fighting even in this way. Cutting off his right hand was a great sacrifice by anyone's standards. However, he had trained his left hand to some extent to pursue an even higher level of swordsmanship, so losing this wouldn't be the worst-case scenario. All of this had been somewhat calculated. But is this person really? Even after showing such submission by cutting off his own right arm, he still insists on taking that child's tongue? It was truly bewildering. There was no longer any justification for endurance. Rather, if he didn't step forward in this situation, it wouldn't be his honor, but his face that would hit rock bottom. Grip. In an instant, O Qianmu's mind became complicated. If he fought to maintain face, defeat was inevitable. But if he didn't step forward here, he would be branded a coward who didn't lift a finger even as his son was being brutally treated. It was truly a dilemma. I was foolish. What he thought was an excellent move turned out to be a losing move. Normally, in such a situation, one would stop out of propriety, but this person's actions were the opposite of expectations. Perhaps it would have been better to fight risking his life rather than cutting off his arm. It was then. Swish. At that moment, Mok Jiangun, who had been making a gesture of twisting, stopped and said, "It seems I've become quite soft-hearted." A look of puzzlement flashed in O Qianmu's eyes. He thought he would have to fight after all, but suddenly stopping like this, what was his intention? Had he changed his mind after taking a hard line? But then, the master's filial heart for his child is so touching. If I were to tear out his son's tongue here as well, it wouldn't look very good, would it? Then are you also backing down? I suppose so. However, I don't particularly like leaving loose ends. Loose ends? Is he asking for a pledge not to seek revenge? If that's the case, he could certainly give it. He hadn't even thought about revenge in the first place. He had surpassed wall after wall and reached the way of the sword, extreme of the sword over many years. But this person was clearly much younger than himself. How could he dream of catching up and seeking revenge in any lifetime? I have too much to lose. The more one has in hand, the more one thinks of consolidation rather than future troubles. To this, O Qianma spoke in a cautious voice. It was an action to save my child, how can you blame this? If your anger has been appeased by this old man too wishes to make a clear end here. It's good that you're magnanimous. But I tend to be quite cautious. O Qianmu inwardly clicked his tongue. What a difficult person. How can someone who has reached such a high realm be so cautious? Or is he meticulous? To this, O Qianmu exhaled softly and said, "Then what do you want? If you want a promise, I can even leave it in writing." In writing? Not bad. But something written on paper can always be torn up. Then what on earth do you want? I have some sense of shame, so asking for your Danjian to be destroyed seems excessive. Since it's come to this, how about receiving your remaining arm as well? At that moment, O Qianmu's expression twisted terribly. He wondered what on earth he would demand, but he never imagined he would ask for his remaining arm as well. Murmur, murmur. The surroundings stirred. Has this person truly gone mad? Even though Master O had put aside his pride as one of the six heavens and made such concessions for his son, to ask him to cut off his remaining arm as well? He had truly crossed the line. At this, Master, this is not right. We will help the Master too. The second young Master will understand the Master's heart. You must not submit. You don't need to endure any longer. Cries of anger burst out from here and there. At their boiling cries, strength entered Master Okianmu's hand, holding the sword in his left hand. Not content with cutting off his son's two arms, he asks for his remaining arm. He had certainly crossed the line properly. No more. It seems many are angry. But you should listen to the end of what I was saying. To the end? Now that, if the Master, with great spirit of sacrifice, cuts off his remaining left arm himself, I'll reattach one of your son's arms. What? At these words from Mok Jayangan, everyone was dumbfounded. How could he reattach an arm that had already been cut off? To spout something that can't be done even if a god came down, is he taking the Master and themselves for fools? Don't you believe me? Mok Jayangan said with a slight smile. They shouted. What nonsense are you talking? Master, this person is insulting you. There's no need to listen. Right now. But then. Slash. At that moment, one of the swords floating with the sword control with energy technique flew and cut off the arm of one of the spiritual sword sanctuary's sword disciples, who was shouting. Ag. Clang. At this sudden sword strike, everyone around drew their swords. Was he really going to do this? At that moment. Whoosh. Hook. As Mok Jayangan opened his hand and pulled, the sword disciple whose arm had been cut off was forcibly flown to the front of Mok Jayangan by his vast true energy. Although he was a first-class expert, compared to Mok Jayangan's realm, he was no better than a bug on the ground, so he couldn't withstand the true energy. Swish. Are you truly going to see this through to the end? Master Okianmu aimed his sword held in his left hand at Mok Jayangan. Mok Jayangan shrugged and said, Since you don't believe me, I'm just trying to show you. What do you? It was then. Float, float. The severed arm rose up and flew towards the sword disciple, who was caught by the true energy. In that state, Mok Jayangan lightly struck the acupoints on the severed part. Then, as if the bleeding had been stopped, the blood somewhat ceased. It will hurt a bit. What are you doing? Thud. At that moment, the floating severed arm attached to the severed part of the sword disciple's arm. In that state, Mok Jayangan held sword intent in his right hand and placed it on the severed part. Then with his left hand. Tap. 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 Lim. 2. John. J. Jean. Gi. He formed the abbreviated hand seals of the 9-character resurrection technique. As he formed the hand seals, red heat flowed from the tip of the sword intent in Mok Jayangan's right hand. Huh? The sword disciple was startled and didn't know what to do. However, his body was forcibly bound by the true energy, so he couldn't move at all. Then Mok Jayangan moved the sword intent along the severed part. In that state. Eastern Blue Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. Central Yellow Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. Western White Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. Northern Black Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. Central Yellow Emperor Great General God, I invoke you. He chanted the incantation inwardly. Sizzle. Along with this, smoke rose from the severed part where the sword intent passed. The sword disciple screamed in pain that felt like burning. Aarg. Seeing the sword disciple suffering like this, Master Okianma finally stepped forward. He was the only one who could face this person. Stop right now. Whoosh. Okianmu, who had kicked off the ground, narrowed the distance in an instant and aimed for Mok Jayangan's brow. Then Mok Jayangan, as if using the sword disciple as a shield, put him in the path. This. Because of this, Okianmu had to change the trajectory of his sword. Okianmu, who had brilliantly changed direction with a variation technique, created sword shadows in more than 10 directions, forming a shape like fully bloomed flower buds closing in reverse. Everyone couldn't help but admire his splendid sword technique. It was so excellent that even the sword technique he displayed with his left hand, not his right, made people wonder why he had stepped back earlier. But then, thud. Mok Jayangan thrust the sword disciple's head into the center of the trajectory of the closing flower buds. Okianmu's eyes shook. Although he had diligently trained his left hand as well, with his skill he could precisely avoid this and aim for Mok Jayangan, but if the trajectory deviated even a little, the sword disciple would die. Whoosh! Finally, Okianmu gave up on unleashing his technique, created distance, and shouted, "How can you be so cowardly?" Okianmu's eyes widened as he shouted. This was because the sword disciple who had been suffering until just now had unknowingly moved his severed arm. Huh? The sword disciple who had unconsciously moved it now seemed to realize this, looking at his previously severed arm in surprise. The pain had disappeared, and he could move his arm and fingers freely at will. The sword disciple's expression became one of disbelief. This is... The other sword disciples and guests around also had the same reaction. They had been wondering what on earth he was doing, but the sword disciple's severed arm had really been reattached. It was a sight unbelievable even after seeing it. While everyone was amazed, Mok Jayangan said, "I told you, didn't I? That I could reattach a severed arm. Did it sound like empty words?" This was a healing technique called the Three Marvels method. Although there were several tricky conditions, if these were met, it was a miraculous technique that could even reattach a severed arm. Among these conditions, the biggest restriction was that it required the subject's primal energy. In simple terms, it meant sacrificing part of one's lifespan. Naturally, the stronger the technique, the greater the restrictions had to be, but since it didn't consume one's own primal energy, it was a useful method. Now, what will you do? If you give your remaining arm, I'll reattach your son's arm. The choice is entirely up to you, Master. Master Okianmu was speechless at Mok Jayangan's proposal. As the greatest craftsman in the Central Plains and one of the Six Heavens, he could usually maintain the upper hand in any deal, no matter who came. But not this time. He had never encountered someone so cunning. To say he would reattach his son's severed arm if he gave up his remaining arm? Hurry and choose. Will it be your son's arm or your own? Grip. Okianmu bit his lip hard. He had never met someone so vicious. From the start, there was no real choice in this proposal. He would lose everything no matter what he chose. If he cut off his arm, it would be as good as ending his life as a martial artist or craftsman, and if he didn't cut it off, it would be like abandoning his son, and he would have to fight this person anyway. If that happened, he would lose everything all the same. Drip. A situation where he could choose nothing, caught between a rock and a hard place. The master's forehead was now drenched in sweat, and his head throbbed as if it would split. Murmur, murmur. He couldn't hear a thing as those around him clamored. Okianmu's dazed gaze eventually turned to Mok Jayangan. Shudder. Okianmu's expression froze when he saw Mok Jayangan's face. He was smiling as if all this was enjoyable, but that smile was full of malice. The bastard was testing him, no, toying with him. Evil spirit. This person is truly like an evil spirit. Now he understood. From the beginning, the bastard was aware that he was trying to avoid fighting under the pretext of doing it for his son. That's why he induced this situation. A situation where no matter what he chose, it would be the worst outcome. Tremble. Realizing this, Okianmu felt, for the first time in his life, intense fear and terror towards another human being. It wasn't because he was a peerless sword master surpassing himself. This person, like an evil spirit, thoroughly manipulated and subjugated even the hearts of others. In the end, unable to choose anything, Okianmu, thud, fell to his knees on the spot. Master. Father! Everyone cried out in surprise at this sight. But Okianmu no longer heard anyone else's gaze or voice. Suffering as if his head would explode between two paths filled only with the worst outcomes, he finally let go of everything as if attaining enlightenment. Thud. Okianmu then bowed his head to the ground before Mok Jiangun and said, "This old man begs for forgiveness like this. I will do anything you want, so please show mercy." Chapter 365. Sword. Part 6. This old man begs for forgiveness like this. I will do anything you want, so please show mercy. For a moment, silence fell. Everyone looked at Master Okianmu with shocked expressions. How could such a thing happen? Not only had he cut off his arm, but now he had even knelt down, he who was the master of the spiritual sword sanctuary, called the sacred place of swordsmanship, and one of the six heavens, considered the pinnacle of the current martial world. This isn't right. Is it really because of the second young master? Isn't this tantamount to a declaration of defeat? Only now did the sword disciples of the spiritual sword sanctuary and the guests start to find this strange. No matter how precious a son might be, it was inconceivable for someone called the pinnacle of martial artists to so easily discard his dignity. Could it be that he judged there was nothing he could do no matter what he chose? As everyone was speechless with shock, it happened. Thud. At that moment, the youngest, O Yianwu, hurriedly approached, prostrated himself, and said, "Master of the holy fire, I too will beg like this. Please show mercy." Young master. The sword disciples of the spiritual sword sanctuary shouted in angry voices at O Yianwu's action. It was frustrating enough that the master was showing such a sight in front of the guests, but what was this? But it wasn't just him. Thud. Junior Master O Wunghuang also approached, knelt beside him, and bowed his head. And in a solemn voice, he said, "If it's difficult to quell your anger, I, as the master's successor, will offer my head in front of everyone. Please, in your mercy, end this here." What? Why is even the junior master doing this? Those watching couldn't hide their frustration. Why were Master Okianmu, who was called close to the best in the world in discussing swords, and his family lowering themselves to this person, enduring such shame? They took pride as sword disciples and considered the master's sword to be the best under heaven, which is why they gathered here, calling this place the sacred ground of swordsmanship. For them, the sight of the one they respected subjecting himself to such humiliation was something they absolutely could not understand, no, could not accept. Clang. Shing. The guests too drew their swords. One by one, they shouted, "Master! If you're doing this to prevent your son and those here from being sacrificed, stop now. We too are martial artists. We are prepared to die at any time. That's right. If the master leads, we will all follow. Don't show weakness to the enemy. That's right. Let us be the master's strength. Let's not just watch, but help Master O and protect the Sword Valley with our own hands." Wah wah. The sword disciples and guests, who were not just angry but enraged, raised their morale and shouted. Seeing them like this, Moyong Hak, dispatched as an investigator from the Righteous Alliance, who was watching from a distance, couldn't contain his excitement and said, "Sate. Shouldn't we help too?" At his words, Zhang Myong Sate of the Hangshan sect spoke with a serious face. "It doesn't seem like a problem that can be solved by helping." "What do you mean?" "Master O is being toyed with by that Fire Faith Order member, with his son taken hostage. Are you saying we should just watch?" "Ba. Patron Moyong, do you truly not understand why Master O is doing this?" "What? Master O isn't doing this because of his son and the guests." "What do you mean?" "I hope this humble monk's judgment is wrong, but it seems Master O believes there's no hope even if he fights that person." At these words, Moyong Hak's eyes widened. "What does this mean? Are you saying that Master O, one of the 6 Grand Masters called the pinnacle of the current martial world, bowed his head, sensing defeat even before fighting, to an unheard of newcomer?" It was incomprehensible. Even if that person was strong, it was impossible for him to be overwhelmingly stronger than Master O, who had reached the extreme in swordsmanship. Then, shouldn't he fight, risking his life to protect his own honor? Even if the other was strong, for an expert of Master O's level, shouldn't he fight, risking his life to protect his own honor? Where has his pride as a martial artist gone? It seems some are feeling disappointed. Goe, who was watching the situation as if it were someone else's business with his hands behind his back, inwardly clicked his tongue. In the end, this happened. He had thought such a situation wouldn't occur due to his reputation and the reverence of the Central Plains people, but it did. As expected, O Qianmu, you were ultimately just a craftsman. O Qianmu's martial arts had reached a level that everyone could acknowledge. When one is said to be close to the best in the world in discussing swords, isn't that almost the highest praise? It certainly was. However, Goe, who had stayed here for a long time and experienced Master O Qianmu, believed he crucially lacked two things. One of those was lack of actual combat experience. It would be fair to say that O Qianmu had the least actual combat experience among those called the current top martial artists of the 6 heavens and 8 stars. The spiritual sword sanctuary was close to a neutral sect not belonging to the orthodox sects. The reason was that for a long time, they had focused more on activities as craftsmen rather than as martial artists. As a result, they had never particularly been hostile to or fought with other sects. At most, it was just martial arts competitions or sword discussions with the guests of the Sword Valley. Since their insights had increased by experiencing numerous secret techniques and sword techniques of many sword disciples accumulated since the previous generation, they couldn't help but be outstandingly strong in martial arts competitions or sword discussions. However, they had never actually fought a life-or-death battle even once. Nevertheless, the reason Master O came to be called one of the 6 heavens was because Yonghyan, who was also one of the 6 heavens and the leader of the Righteous Alliance, had a sword discussion with Master O and acknowledged that he had reached the extreme of swordsmanship. Because of this, martial artists recognized him as one of the 6 heavens. But he actually lacks pride as a martial artist. Martial artists shouldn't just be good at theory. They trained in martial arts to protect themselves and fight others. Furthermore, martial artists were those who cut down enemies. However, Master O Qianmu, no, the O clan of the spiritual sword sanctuary, had a clear sense of mission and pride as craftsmen, but lacked the will to fight someone. Without the will to fight, naturally, there was no way they could have pride as martial artists. Ah, Master O. You're finally showing your limitations. Goe sighed and felt disappointed. He had vaguely sensed that he lacked the will to fight, but when placed in an extreme situation, it was revealed to be true. He was only half complete. Goe, shaking his head, shifted his gaze away from Master O Qianmu. The time he had spent here trying to break the way of the sword, extreme of the sword, wasn't wasted, but he no longer had interest in someone who had revealed his own limitations. No, there was no reason to be interested anymore. An opponent who could further draw out his will to fight had appeared. Swish! His gaze naturally turned to Mok Jiangyun. Mok Jiangyun glanced at the prostrated Master O Qianmu and his 2 sons, then snorted and said, "It seems the people behind you want you to fight me, Master." At this, Master O Qianmu raised his head and spoke. "My members and guests, please do not step forward anymore. This is a matter that this old man and the sir here must resolve." "Master, how can you say that? We are prepared to risk our lives." Silence. At his thunderous shout, the sword disciples and guests were startled into silence. When they quieted down, Master O Qianmu continued speaking without even giving them a glance. "That sword on the cliff is in a place even this old man cannot reach. How can you, who cannot even properly see that, risk your lives? Do not interfere any further." At his firm resolve, the sword disciples and guests closed their mouths. Not only was it difficult to step forward when the master spoke so decisively, but disappointment was evident in their eyes. They were gathered here solely out of respect for him. Although they might be lacking in skill, they had the will to fight, risking their lives if he led them. However, seeing him ultimately abandon his pride as a martial artist and choose humiliation and defeat for himself, their will was also broken. Ignoring them, Master Okianmu bowed his head again and said, "I will do as you, no, as the noble sir wishes. Please show mercy." Ah. Mok Jyangun, who had been staring at him thoroughly lowering himself, clicked his tongue. He had become interested when he saw him cut off his own arm and pushed him to see how he would respond this time, but it turned out differently from what he had wanted, so he lost interest. He belonged neither to the pride of a martial artist nor to paternal love for his child. "What do you intend to do now?" At that moment, Chong Ryong's voice rang in his ear. Mok Jyangun shrugged at this. "Well, I should end it moderately." "If you're going to end it moderately, why did you push so hard?" "Well, to eliminate future troubles, I needed to make sure. And even though I knew the difference in martial arts, I was curious how someone who had reached this level would react. Wasn't fighting that blade user enough? If I competed properly with one of the 6 heavens, I could gauge what level I'm at." "What?" Chong Ryong was exasperated. Only this mortal would try to gauge how far he had come by facing the 6 heavens, called the pinnacle of the current martial world. For this extremely cautious guy to act so boldly, he must have some confidence in his own strength. The time is ripe. Chong Ryong didn't show it, but she was gradually becoming excited. No matter how talented the mortal was, she had thought it would take at least 10 years to take revenge. However, this monster-like guy had shortened this to an unbelievable level. In just half a year, he had reached a level equal to or surpassing the 6 heavens. It might be possible now. There was already a considerable force built up within the Heaven and Earth Society, and the subordinates gathered outside were no ordinary people either. Now, the revenge she wanted might be possible. No, with this guy, it would be possible. It's not far off. She couldn't hide her inner excitement. At that moment, Mok Jyangun withdrew the true energy that was about to tear out the second son O Wongsong's tongue. As he withdrew the true energy from his tongue, O Wongsong collapsed on the ground. "Ugh. Quickly stop the bleeding. He might die from blood loss." At these words, Junior Master O Wunghuang rushed to the fallen O Wongsong, pressed his blood-stopping points, and hurriedly wrapped the severed part of his arm with cloth torn from his clothes. Watching O Wongsong barely saved from death, Master O Qianmu unconsciously breathed a sigh of relief. No matter what, a child was still a child. Mok Jyangun said to him. "You said you could do anything, but how far can you go?" At these words, Master O Qianmu's expression became subtle. He had felt extreme fear towards Mok Jyangun and had practically surrendered, but seeing him speak like this, he became afraid of what he might demand. This old man will do anything within his power. He drew a line, unable to accept demands like cutting off his arm. It meant to demand within limits he could accept. Within your power. Then it shouldn't be particularly difficult. If you want a sword to be crafted, I could make the finest sword befitting you. No. These swords are enough for me. Mok Jyangun casually tapped the 2 magic swords at his waist and said nonchalantly. Then, let the master and the spiritual sword sanctuary swear loyalty to me. For a moment, everyone doubted their ears.